Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're a little behind, and we're letting folks gather in. I want to thank you all for coming, and welcome to the California Freight Advisory Committee meeting here in San Bernardino. The CFAC meeting is convened just about every quarter, and we're always glad to be in different places and really glad to be here. Pleased to be joined by several notables, including Commissioner Inman. Where did she go? Oh, she's right there. All right. But first, I'm looking around. I don't see John Belinsky. Is John here?
He will be here very shortly.
Okay. Is Ray here too? They're both coming again. There. But I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Wolf and the staff of the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority for their excellent hosting skills and hospitality. It's really been a treat to work with you all, at least get us set up and be ready to go. And a lot of provisions are made for us too. So I appreciate that. Real quick housekeeping, the restrooms are in the hallway. And I'm also required to tell you how we evacuate in the event of an emergency. It's through those two doors that have exit signs on them, not through these two doors over here, which go into the offices. So we want to make sure that if we have to evacuate, we go through there. The CFAC meetings are public meetings and are subject to Bagley-Keene Act. And as committee chair, I will allow for public comments at the end of our conversations. For questions and comments from the audience, please let our staff know, and we can get a mic over to you. As a courtesy, we ask that you all keep your phones silent or on stun mode. And if you have to take a call, please step outside of the boardroom to respect those who might be presenting. The microphones are a little bit, they need you to be very close to them. If you're far away, it's not going to pick you up. So make sure you press the button once, the toggle button, press it once, stick into it. Once you're done, please turn your mics off. And by all means, keep your cell phones away from the mic. They interfere and will cause problems with the audio on the web. Our meeting is just a quick overview on the agenda. We have sent the agenda out. There's a couple of changes on the agenda that was sent out. They're not dramatic changes. We have a presentation by Tasha Clements from Federal Highways. She would still make the presentation, but would be on the phone instead of being present. The item 5 on the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program update, that was to be presented by Don Cheeser. She can't join us today, unfortunately, but we have Garth Hopkins from the Commission here with us, and Garth will take her place. The lineup for our presentation is really tight. We have a short meeting today, but I think it's going to be a meaningful meeting, and we'll get a chance to talk about the corridor enhancement program that the Commission is working on, or we'll talk about the infra program that the feds are running. We'll spend some time on item 6 talking about project nomination, and Chris Schmidt will lead that effort. We'll give you an update on the freight mobility plan. Rahul's going to lead that conversation, and then we'll wrap up with some action items and next steps. So it's a pretty tight meeting. We hope to get everybody out of here by 2:30. There's an optional tour at the end of the meeting of the Santa Fe Depot Museum by CFAC members. Space is limited, so if you are interested, please let Elaine Humani know. Elaine is over here in the blue. Let her know that you are interested so she can have you signed up. With that, I want to take a special moment to thank Elaine and staff. They do a wonderful job of setting us up. We just show up like the circus, and they clean up after us. Anyway, and so it's really a pleasure to work with these folks from Caltrans. And so to kick off, I know he's really antsy and he can't stand it that he's standing and I'm not letting him talk. We welcome our host. Dr. Ray Wolf, the Executive Director of the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority.
Thank you, Comey, and welcome everybody to San Bernardino. It is August here, and so nobody should have been surprised when you walked into the furnace that is San Bernardino in late August. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here today. Traditionally, we have PowerPoint presentations talking about things that are going on in the region. But what I want to try and do here today, and I'm going to stop it before it starts on me, is a virtual tour that really, I think, will highlight just how vast and interconnected the transportation network is in this region and the issues that we're dealing with in the Inland Empire, particularly in San Bernardino County. So I'm going to call this presentation Soaring Over Southern California in deference to our friends in Anaheim. So what you're seeing on the screen right now, and I've got a pointer here that hopefully will work. So right here is where we're sitting in the Santa Fe Depot. This building is going to celebrate its 100th anniversary next year. And so that's kind of a cool fact. Right outside here, and the reason that Comey said we need to be leaning into our mic, you can hear a lot of train activity. This is BNSF's intermodal facility here in the city of San Bernardino. A very active yard. We've also got Metrolink trains that are pulling up right out in front of the doors here. And so there's a lot of train noise. Please feel free, if somebody's talking and you can't hear from them during the presentation, to ask them to speak up or speak closer into their mic. And so we're going to kind of back out of the area here in just a minute and take a flyover. Now you can kind of see the entire LA basin. And we're really gonna move over now to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, because that's really where the freight conversation in Southern California begins. And so we can see just how substantial the infrastructure is in these two port complexes. Over $500 billion in freight is moved through these ports. 40% of the containerized freight that is received in the United States is handled in these two port complexes. And so you can just see how significant that is. We're gonna start to move into the LA area, the eastern LA area. This is BNSF's facility at Hobart Yard. And this is where a lot of those goods are transferred to different trains and for destinations beyond or coming here to this area. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to fly east following the 10 freeway. And many of you, if you came in on Ontario Airport, I'm going to stop it for a moment, but if you came on Ontario Airport today, you headed east on the 10 freeway. And so what you see in the middle of the screen, basically from the bottom of the screen up, that's the 10 freeway right there looking east. But what's really interesting, and this is one of the comments that I was making several years ago when we constituted this committee, when we were looking at the primary freight network and those discussions, I was really trying to push, because many regions in this country only have a single facility that goods are moved through that particular region. But in this area, because of the amount of goods that are moved through our ports, again, 40% of the containerized goods that are received in the United States come through our two ports here in LA and Long Beach, and then are moved through the area before they head off to destinations outside of the region. Because of that extensive goods movement, we've got several parallel facilities. So what you see in the middle of the screen is the 10 freeway, but just to the north is the 210 freeway, and just to the south, the right of the screen here is the 60 freeway. And so these are 10 miles apart at the maximum extent. And it really then provides what we like to call a transportation corridor, right? And I would argue that it's really it's a complete corridor in that in our transportation corridor, we not only have highway facilities, we also have two railroads that are paralleling this, a BNSF railroad line and a UP main railroad line coming out of the ports. We have housing, we have parks and recreation, we have infrastructure, we have industry, all contained in this transportation or complete corridor. The amount of truck traffic that we see on these facilities on the 10 freeway, there's almost 26,000 trucks a day. and that represents about 10% of the traffic mix. On the 60 freeway, which is again the one here on the right of the screen, we've got nearly 29,000 trucks daily, which is about 13.5% of the traffic mix. The 210, which was it's a more recent facility heading further east into this area, only has about 11,000 trucks on a daily basis, and that only represents about 6% of the traffic mix. But that truck volume on the 210 is growing, again, because they have a choice. As they're coming out of the ports and heading east, they can choose to use the 60, the 10, or the 210, and they're going to make those choices based on information that's available to them at the time. And so, we've got in this corridor just truck traffic, 65,000 trucks a day running through this corridor. So that's how significant this is. We're heading east along the 10 freeway. The green line that's kind of diagonal across there is the county line coming into San Bernardino County. Just zooming in briefly on the 10 freeway, we've got a big project to introduce express lanes as a way to start to move traffic through our area. We've now flown over to Ontario International Airport. We're kind of just wrap around the airport for a moment. I'm going to pause it briefly. And I want you to look at two things here. One is there's still some undeveloped land in and around the airport property. That's all about to change with local control back of the airport property. One of the mechanisms to try to bring more airlines in is to lease out that property and then use the revenue generated from that to reduce the landing fees. And so that's one thing that's going to happen. And I can tell you, when you look around, the second thing is look at the rooftops, right? Surrounding this airport property and expanding beyond there, it's logistics and warehousing. And that's a theme that you're going to continue to see throughout the San Bernardino Valley area as we move forward. And in fact, the logistics and distribution area represents 20% of our economic throughput in this county, and in fact 20% of our workforce is in this arena. And so it's a significant part of our economy. It is today, and it will continue to be well into the future. Now we're going to kind of head north along the 15 freeway. Those of you who have been in Southern California have probably traversed the 15 freeway on your way to Vegas, on your way to Laughlin, on your way to the Colorado River, Lake Havasu, and you know that there's a lot of traffic issues on this freeway. In particular, when we look kind of in the center of the screen, this is what we call the Devore Junction. Now, back in the 60s, Interstate 15, which coming out of the Cajon Pass, used to run along the foothills here into San Bernardino. But in the early 60s, the Federal Highway Administration redesignated what used to be State Route 31 as Interstate 15. When they did that, they did not reconfigure the junction here. So if you wanted to stay on the 15, whether you were traversing it northbound or southbound, you actually had to exit the 15 in order to get around this curve here at the junction. So a couple of years ago, we finished a project working with Caltrans to rebuild that substantially so that when you're on the 15, a driver expectation is that you would stay on the 15 as you continue through that facility, and that now happens. You're also going through a fairly significant grade as you're starting to climb into the Cajon Pass, which, as you might imagine, for heavy freight trucks is an issue. And so the mix of heavy freight and passenger vehicles was a problem through that area. We've added truck bypass lanes in there, very similar to what you see at the 514 as they're climbing up the pass there. And so that's really been a significant relief for a bottleneck. And this is really the major thoroughfare for goods that are headed to destinations beyond California's borders. So after they've gone through the distribution and warehousing here in our area, then they're headed off on the 15 freeway, which is kind of running diagonal out here through Barstow and then either southeast on State Route 40 or Interstate 40 or heading on to Vegas on 15. This is US 395 right here. And then we're in the Victor Valley right now, and as we swing over a little bit further north, You'll see the red line there is the proposed high desert corridor, which would connect the Antelope Valley with the Victor Valley here. That's a project that has been environmentally cleared. We're still struggling with how that gets built. But what we're looking at right now is what used to be the old George Air Force Base. It's been converted into what we call the Southern California Logistics Airport, SCLA, and the intent is someday that perhaps becomes an inland port. So that's what's going on up in the high desert here. We're coming back down the 15 freeway, and we're going to take a peek looking down into Riverside County. And again, just notice the rooftops, the significant amount of real estate, 200 million square feet of real estate dedicated to logistics and warehousing in this area. We're now looking east of Ontario International Airport and heading that way. And again, just continue looking at the rooftops along the 10 freeway. This is the Union Pacific facility there in Fontana. And now we're going to come in. We've talked about Colton Crossing early on when this group started meeting. And this is really, I think, a great success in our county. It's in the city of Colton. It's not that far from where we are today. And what you have here is you have the Union Pacific line, which is stretching across here, running east-west. That's our main line coming out of the ports. Significant traffic on there. I think on that line, that's our LA Alhambra subdivision. There's 51 trains a day, freight trains, and 13 passenger trains a day. That used to be an at-grade crossing with the main Union Pacific trains. And so you can imagine the Union Pacific line, or not Union Pacific, the BNSF line, that's their San Bernardino subdivision, carries 67 freight trains a day. So you can imagine the conflict that existed when you had these two freight facilities, that one of them had to wait for the other to get through there. And the impacts to the community in this in particular, well, this was originally a railroad town. You've got that much traffic sitting there. You've got noise pollution. You've got emissions pollution and all of that. And also the impacts to just local circulation. If you've got a mile or 2 mile train sitting there idling, waiting for another train to pass through, it was a real problem for the community. And so this has been a great success for our community here in San Bernardino County. So now we're gonna head a little bit further east, and I'm almost done. I want to just pause right here, and then we'll be done. What we're looking at now is we're looking west along the 10 freeway. This is San Bernardino International Airport here. This used to be the Norton Air Force Base. It was closed a number of years ago. It had a huge economic impact. It was a huge stress to the community out here for a very long time. It's starting to, well, it's been redeveloped significantly, and they're continuing to do a lot. Right just south of the runways, that's the big Amazon fulfillment centers. It's a huge facility out here. Anybody that's in this region that's receiving anything today from Amazon, it probably is coming out of this fulfillment center. Stater Brothers headquartered right in this area out here. And again, you can see there's a lot of rooftops for logistics and warehousing. That's a huge part of the community out here and will continue to be for a long time. So goods movement, the impact of goods movement, both positive and negative, is felt very strongly out in this community. And so, again, I appreciate everybody coming down here today, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion. Thank you.
What more do you want? Can I tackle the football more?
Well, thanks, Ray. I think to say that we're in the epicenter of freight is kind of an understatement, and I really appreciate that overview, because I think there's a lot you can't see at the human scale, and it's really, I think it's brilliant to have that fly through to give you a rather impressive perspective of the spread of freight and the connection to the ports, and actually just the footprint that it has here in the Inland Empire. I think it's something that can be missed if you don't actually if you don't live it daily. So thank you for that overview and the welcome. We appreciate that. In the interest of time, we have Tasha on. She's going to be joining us, I assume, very shortly. So I want to click over to her. We're not ready for her yet? Okay. All right. Among the notables that we have is our Assistant Secretary for Rail and Ports at the California Transportation Authority agency, actually, more agency. Ben D'Alva, you all know Ben. Ben's going to give us an update from the agency.
Yeah, thank you, Coleman. Again, these items this update is I think in the best interest that we have a standing item, so our agency can give an update on all things that are kind of happening in Sacramento. Last meeting, we heard from Brian Annis on the topic of SB1. I think today I'm just going to share with you all briefly on just an update on the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. There was a couple items that took place since we last met. And then really most of the update is the agenda today. I think hearing about the INFRA grants, stuff that we're thinking about in our office, planning for the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program at the CTC. It's a priority for SB1 implementation. And then, of course, getting project priorities aligned and identifying which projects we're going to be putting forward in that program. You're going to hear more about that on the agenda later today. So, but in the two updates that I have for the Sustainable Freight Action Plan is one, the Secretary participated in the Sustainable Freight Think Tank Symposium, which took place last month in Santa Monica. It was a very good discussion. Commissioner Hinton was there as well. A small group, but we had a candid conversation about freight priorities in the state and some stuff that's happening nationally. There's going to be a report put together sort of outlining and discussing some of the topics that were chatted about there. So we'll look forward to that and provide another update once that report comes out. And the other item, maybe some of you all are aware, we I think sent a note through the CFAC email address that we have our pilot project work plans posted on the California Sustainable Freight Action Plan website. So feel free to go to the website and take a look at the 3 pilots that are there. Again, one is the biodairy gas project that the Air Board is leading in conjunction with the state partners, and then 2 from Caltrans, one at the border and another in the Southern California area. Both of the Caltrans pilots are very ITS heavy. The Southern California one also has a truck parking component to it. So I encourage everyone to read them, and we will pursue what we can in terms of funding those projects in the near future. And then we've made a commitment to provide an update as to the status of those pilots next year when we do an overall update on the implementation of the Sustainable Freight Action Plan as a whole. So that's it for today, and thank you, and happy to take any questions unless we're out of time for Tasha.
We can take questions. Are there any questions for Ben? I was going to exercise the chair's prerogative, and by the way, if you have any questions, just like as a tradition, just turn your nameplate on the side, and we'll call on you. I was going to exercise the chair's prerogative and actually ask Commissioner Inman to give us a brief overview, being present at the think tank, because most of you are familiar with the outcomes of the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. One of those 9 items that we were going to implement was a think tank that would get some minds together on freight and talk through some thorny issues, and that was what Ben was referring to, so I appreciate Ben bringing that up. I want to make sure that do we have Tasha on? Okay, so while we're waiting for Tasha, why don't I let Commissioner Inman go forward with the presentation, and I'll come back to your question.
Thanks, Comey, and I too want to add my thanks to Ray for hosting us, and for the aerial perspective. I leaned over to Comey and said, we always need to use that, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to really comprehend how integrated all of these pieces are. And when we hear numbers and stats, it's one thing, but when The only thing better, I think, is that we can see it automated, so it's really moving before our eyes, because being a person that drives on that 60 and the 10 freeway on a regular basis, I can tell you, I don't know if there's 65,000 trucks total in that corridor, but there's an awful lot of trucks. And, you know, we don't have truck-only lanes in our state for the most part, but I think we come as close to having one de facto in that corridor as anywhere. So I did have the honor and privilege of attending the Freight Symposium. I'm hoping that this is the kickoff of a series of these ongoing events. I think there's nothing better than all of us learning from each other and to bring the various partners to the table. We were privileged to have representatives from the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission. And I say the sooner we all sit around the table and learn together, the better off we're all going to be. Because as you know, we've all been on this educational journey, whether you've spent your career in the freight sector or as a public servant. We all learn something new every day. I think from the symposium, we tried to talk about what a vision for 2030 would be. I think the challenge for most of us is that 2030 is really right around the corner. And if you look at the size of the sector and the number of partners we have, that is absolutely a huge, huge undertaking. We all agreed on the things we've all agreed on before. We want to improve the efficiency, make our state more competitive, and reduce our emissions all simultaneously. And that also is not simple. If it were, someone would have already done it. So we talked a lot about community and community engagement and how do we engage our partners to really work towards solutions. And we know we all have a lot of work to do. We know that there's not going to be one size fits all for these solutions. We talked about autonomous vehicles. We had OEMs there, which is good because we can really hear. Our partner from Volvo Truck was very clear to point out to us that she was not from Volvo, the automotive division, and that it's a very separate process that they're on. What I particularly loved about her perspective was she's actually a commercial driver, so it's great to hear from someone who can really get behind the wheel and tell us what we're making. Clearly, discussion about driver-assisted autonomous. We're probably a very long way from autonomous, but we can certainly have efficiency gains. We had our custodial carriers with us, UPS and FedEx, and these are the guys and the gals that, in my opinion, are really doing the really heavy lifting day in and day out. So it was great to hear their perspective and what their solutions might be. Clearly, we all have a lot more work to do. I was still on my perch wanting California to at least have one of the top 10 supply chain universities in the nation, because I'd done a quick search to see if Comey's daughter had decided to major in logistics, where she would have chosen to attend. For all of you, Comey just dropped his youngest at college. So you're an empty nester now, Comey? You can work more focus on your work? Good. Teasing, we have to have fun while we do this. Anyway, and so, one of the suggestions I had is really for us to learn from what others are saying. And so hopefully, Comey, one of the projects we do together maybe is take a look at those, what are ranked in U.S. News and World Report as the top 10 supply chain optimization universities, and really try to learn what they're doing. And, we do some work in our state, but I think there's a lot more work we can do from learning from each other. So bottom line, it was a good start. We all sat in a circle and tried to learn from each other in terms of the different perspective. I would say that we're on a lot of different levels in terms of how much detail. Clearly everybody there was an expert in their own particular field, but I would say that none of us are an expert in all the fields that were at the table, and that's where I think the really exciting opportunity lies. So great to be here. And Comey, just a little hint, we can learn from others. That meeting was hosted at the Annenberg Community Center. So next time we're having an August meeting, I'm giving Comey a bad time about San Bernardino and the end of August, but we love you, Ray.
Yeah, but how else would I see Ray? You had a quick question. Is she on?
She's on.
She's on, okay. Tasha, give us a minute and we'll get a question in here and then we'll get to you.
I was actually just anticipating that Fran was going to make some comment that I might have to respond to. That's why. So, I had a quick question for Ben. You talked about the pilot project in Southern California, including truck parking. And I'm just curious, industry is supposedly moving very quickly towards dedicated automated truck fleets. And so I'm just wondering, investing in truck parking is important today, but what I'm hearing is we will start to see autonomous truck fleets being deployed as one of the early autonomous vehicles out on the street in the next 4 to 5 years with potentially, complete turnover within a 10-year period. Is that consistent with what you guys are hearing? And if it is the truck parking element as important today? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Thanks for bringing that up. And I flew down with my colleague from the Highway Patrol to this meeting, and we had a nice conversation about progress of autonomous vehicles, particularly with trucks. And while I think it's still a ways away, I haven't heard the time frame that you stated, but I still think it's important to look at truck parking. As we've heard in this committee, we've heard in other stakeholder bodies that truck parking is still important to the state, throughout the state, because of the lack of it and the need to make sure that these truckers aren't parking on community roads and so forth when they're resting. So I think it's worth looking at. I mean, we put it in the pilot as a based off of a local need. That's something that we should be trying out. So I think we should consider it. And the point of a pilot is to try it out. And if it works, then I think we should replicate that around the state. If it's not, then maybe we should reconsider. But appreciate your question.
Can I just jump in, Comey? I think the general consensus is that we will likely see autonomous vehicles first in the freight sector ahead of the individual passenger cars, even though, there's lots of R&D and lots of media around the Google cars and everything, but in practice, to really be able to be utilized, I think first where we'll see it will be on the long haul, not in our urban cores.
Yeah, we in the freight efficiency conversations we've been having, we highlighted truck parking as probably one of the top strategic efficiency things that we need to look at, because it's an easier one to tackle, but it's also a very naughty one in terms of finding space and where to put them. But that's going to be a critical thing going forward. And level 5 autonomous vehicles are probably 20, maybe 25 years out. But you're going to see truck platooning very quickly. We'll get some efficiencies in trucking, but that's still not going to negate the amount of trucks we're going to get that will still need to have rests and parking available to them. So good question. We are going to transition over to Ms. Tasha Clements of the Federal Highways. Tasha, thank you for holding and thank you for your patience. Tasha is the Director of Program Development at the Federal Highways California Division, located in Sacramento. She has served in that role since May 2016 and has over 20 years of planning and environmental planning experience with the U.S. DOT. So with that, I welcome Tasha Clements.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Comey, for that. You shorted me 6 years, 26 years. Hello?
You can't possibly 26 years.
Oh, yes, every day of it. Please don't take any from me. But anyway, I will go ahead and get started. I know that Raul has said I had a very short amount of time on the agenda today, and I have provided a lot of information. But I wanted to say that I am sorry that I wasn't able to be there today in person. It's at the end of our fiscal year, and sometimes we're just not able to travel at this particular time. But I did want to provide you just a little bit of information on the statutory requirements for the Infrastructure for Rebuilding America, which is the INFRA grant program. Next slide. Next slide. Hello?
It's on the next slide. No? Can you see the slides?
It's just still on my very first slide, what I'm seeing.
Okay, we're on slide 3 now, introduction, discretion.
Okay, you're on slide 3. Okay. Well, I won't pay attention to what's on the screen then. Okay, now I see the outline. And can you go ahead and advance it to, there you go, thank you. So for the INFRA program, just wanted to make sure that it is understood that it is a discretionary federal grant program. It does have $1.5 billion that's available for fiscal year 17 and fiscal year 18. If you notice, the INFRA program is basically being utilized to preserve the statutory requirements as well as to utilize the updated criteria to evaluate projects and to make sure that the projects that are received do align with the national and regional economic vitality goals. Now, I do believe that you have in front of you a side-by-side comparison between the Fast Lane Grant Program as well as the new INFRA Grant Program. And what you should notice is that the INFRA program basically focuses more on leveraging increased investments by state, local, as well as private partners. Also, it focuses on promoting improved project performance as well as accountability, and it also provides more of a flexibility for innovative solutions to address specific local needs. One thing that's very important is that if you are considering putting together an application, please make sure that it is submitted by November the 2nd by 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Next slide, please. I won't have the opportunity to go through each slide, but I wanted to make sure that I provided enough information to add as a resource for anyone that's interested in putting together an application. I am on slide 4 right now, and this slide here actually provides a description of who is actually eligible to apply. Next slide, which is slide 5, actually shows what projects are actually eligible. And as you can see on this slide, we talk a lot about freight. This program emphasizes highway projects, but also freight projects are eligible as well. Next slide, which is slide 6. There's information here that I provided on the eligible project cost. Slide 7 actually shows the minimum project size for large projects as well as small projects. I'm on slide 8 now. And on this slide, I have information about the grant amounts as well as the cost share. Just 2 particular items that I wanted to mention. For the minimum fast lane grants, for large projects, it is $25 million, and for the smaller projects, it's $5 million. And for the cost share, you have up to 60% that you can use towards the fast lane grants, as well as up to 80% of the total federal share. Now, what I always suggest to anyone when you see the new programs that are coming out of D.C., there's a lot of confusion sometimes and a lot of questions. Please always reference the law. So if you have any questions about the minimum requirements, please reference 23 USC 117B that provides additional information on the $25 million for the larger projects, and 117E as an egg for the smaller projects. The information about the cost share, I would reference 117J of the law. And I know you might think that, it's a typo with having the term fast lane on the slide. It is not. We're still referencing fast lane because of the fiscal year 16 awards. And those 16 awards are still considered or still titled fast lane. So next slide, which is slide 9. This slide here actually provides a little more information on the requirements for the large and small projects. Next slide. This slide here, I've just added the information of the criteria that each application will be reviewed on. The next couple of slides, next slide, actually provides examples of information that you can utilize when you are putting your application together. I'm on slide 11, going to slide 12. Slide 12 talks about leveraging of federal funds. And slide 13. This slide here talks about potential for innovation. And I wanted to bring to your attention the second sub-bullet, which talks about the use of Experimental Project Delivery Authority, which is SEP 14/15. And that is FHWA's Special Experimental Project number 14 and 15. I would highly recommend that if you are going to put an application together and you are trying to put together the information for the innovation section, log on to our site and look at this information that's available. There's a lot of information as far as experimental projects, that I believe will be beneficial for you to use when trying to put together information on your application being very innovative. Next slide, which is slide 14. This is also just another focus on performance as well as accountability. And slide 15, which is other considerations. The department, when reviewing these applications, will focus on whether or not there's a really good, clear description on geographic diversity, as well as whether or not the project will be ready, meaning at the time of obligation, will the project be ready to go to construction within 18 months? So that is something specifically that if you can elaborate on in your application, that is very clear. Next slide, please. This slide just provided a suggested format that you can use when putting the application together. It is not a requirement, but it is just a suggested format. And the next slide, which is slide 17. Again, I just wanted to make sure that you had enough resources in order for you to put together a quality application. Again, please make sure that your application is submitted by 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on November the 2nd. And if you please go ahead and log into grants.gov, you will see that there is really, really good instructions that's provided in order for you to put the application together. And the last slide, which is slide 18, again, this is just some additional resources for you. If you have questions about how to apply, please use that link. If you have questions about technical questions about the program, you can please submit a question to infogrant@dot.gov. If not, you can contact me directly, and I will try to answer any questions that you may have. So with that, Comey, I have just a couple of seconds if I want to stay within my 10 minutes. If there are any questions there in the room for me.
Oh, thank you very much, Tasha. That was a great run through the presentation. It's a lot of information there, and I'm sure folks have access to the slides, and they can follow up with you. I have to apologize that we do have a question from Kerry.
Thank you. Actually, my question was pertaining to the previous item, so let's see if there's any questions on this item. On the State of Appropriate Action Plan pilot projects, what are the next steps and/or action plan for implementation? And who's the lead for the Southern California pilot? Is that District 7 or headquarters?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry, and I'll take a stab at this one. Well, the next steps is we've put together the work plans, right? I think we want to make sure within those there are various phases identified in the work plans, and I think we want to try to identify which phases, if one, two, or all of them, that we can get funded in the near term. So that's really the next step, logical step, is what can we do to materialize these projects? So come back, and of course, our plan is to keep this body informed on the progress of those, so you won't be out of the loop when it comes to moving forward with these pilots.
Just a quick follow-on. Does the state anticipate using any of your 40% discretionary funds as part of the Freight Corridor Enhancement Program for the pilots?
I think that's definitely an option on the table. We're not going to. We don't have a set path to say this is how we're going to do it. We want to make sure we find whatever's the best way at the time. I definitely would consider that to be a strong option on the table. And of course, if we partner with the regions per the trailer bill SB 103, if it becomes a regional priority and a state priority, that project would receive funding on both sides, the 40 and the 60%. And in terms of leadership, Eric Fredericks is on the work plans for answering any questions. I know he's doing a lot of work and leading it, but it is a district by district project. I don't know if Ome has any other thoughts on leadership, but we're kind of all tackling this as a team.
Well, the projects are complex, so they're not a single, straightforward, one-lane project. So it's going to have multiple stakeholders in it, but the primary main projects are going to be in the districts because they're on the state highway system. But that doesn't limit the level of participation that we'll get from all the partners. The border project is led by both District 11 and San Diego, and there are other partners around the project as well.
Yeah, I would encourage maybe development of working groups, especially for the Southern California one, because it encompasses 5 counties, a lot of agencies. We already have a established working group dealing with freight issues, Los Angeles, Muskeg, LA Metro, RCTC, San Marino, TA.
And keep in mind, these are a product of the governor's executive order. So while Caltrans is the lead, so to speak, on the pilots, it's really a statewide effort to get these pilots done.
Tasha, are you still on?
I am.
A quick question. I don't know if you mentioned it, but is there a limit to how many projects one can put in or agency?
Not that I'm aware of now.
Okay. Shanae?
Tasha, it's Fran. So, as you all know, we haven't done very well on the first 2 little attempts at this. So, any other hints you'd have for us so we could improve our hit ratio in terms of being selected?
Maybe take Vince out to lunch.
We've tried that.
No, Fran, I have no clue. As a matter of fact, there's 2 different panels that's going to be reviewing the application in D.C. at the department level, and then the secretary, as you know, has the final say-so. So all I could just suggest is that you please just continue to put your best foot forward. I believe what really helped, Ome, if you can remember, we actually had Crystal Jones that came out when Caltrans put together a freight tour, and it really provided her an on-site visual of some of the projects that have been submitted for the Fast Lane grant. Not saying that was able to leverage it one way or the other, but it gave her a visual of what's actually here on site. I don't think that we would have time to do that before November the 2nd, but she actually has been able to see what's it actually looks like and what's going on here in California. So I think it's really good to have her, that's sort of in our corner when they are looking at these applications. So everybody is just going to be on the same level. I have no other idea how they're going to, how it's going to be weighed.
A follow-up question on that, because you mentioned in there the benefit cost analysis, and we've had considerable discussion as we look at our trade corridor enhancement program. But is everybody in the U.S. using the same methodology on that, or maybe we're a little tougher on our modeling or something?
That's a good question. I can actually look, try to find out. I'm not sure, but I can actually find that out for you.
I think, if you look at why we're not scoring, if that's one component, that might be good. And then my final question, we clearly understand this is a multimodal approach. Our class ones weren't called out as being able to apply individually. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, too bad, because we've got 2 great class ones.
Mm-hmm. And also, Fran, just so everybody knows, there is every opportunity for any applicant who did not receive funding to call and to have a debriefing. I think that is an excellent option that headquarters is offering. So I would suggest that give them a call and ask them to be more specific as to what could be done better this time, or what was not done in a way that they felt could have been presented in a different way for better consideration.
I don't see any other questions. Oh, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Michael Cano. I'm representing LA Metro. It's good to be here with our partners in San Bernardino County. Segueing off of that discussion about the debrief, we did have a debrief with USDOT staff. And one of the items that came out very clearly was that this program is A, designed to heavily leverage multiple sources of non-federal funding as best as possible, and B, that funding source needs to be very secure when we put forth our applications. Now, the state of California, and this may bridge into the next conversation, has done a tremendous job of creating a brand new source of funding for projects that will be submitted for infra. I mean, all of those projects basically will be qualified under the TCP program, or potentially the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, especially if they're managed lane or some kind of project like that. So one of our questions we have is simply this: what is the state's position and plan or policy that will allow us to put in our application state contribution, state participation, that would only come through potentially a competitive grant program that we're doing for all the different programs under SB1, that won't happen until after potentially the grant awards for infra are announced first part of 2018. We're having a situation where we have plenty of projects we want to submit. It's the same roster of projects that we're going to submit for the trade corridors or the SCC program. And we're trying to figure out how do we put on there anticipated state participation that we won't know because it's going to go through a competitive grant process, which DOT has said we have concerns about funding attached to a program that's at risk or is not secured and can't take credit for it. So,
yeah, no, I think your question is very valid and actually very crucial. But I don't know that there's a straight or easy answer to it. The process requires us to have guidelines, the commission adopt the guidelines before the grants can go out, and it's competitive, so you really can't assign the monies anyway. So my sense is I don't know that there's a whole lot to do. Maybe there's somebody that can divine the process of assigning state funds that are not yet programmed to folks that are applying for grants in November. I don't see how you do that. I think that's just going to be one of the unfortunate circumstances that we find ourselves in this cycle of infra. It seems to me, a very serious problem. My hope is that the next cycle around we will be in a better position to be able to go after them. But I would argue that the projects that are potentially more competitive in this first cycle of infra are probably projects that have been around with dedicated funding on them already, that already have enough support and stakeholdership around them, that have been presented over and over again, like Frank said, and haven't competed well in the past few grants that we've had at the federal level. So I would assume those would be the ones that might be more competitive. We couldn't have everybody else come to the table at this point in November. Good question, thank you. I want to take a moment to, Tasha, thank you for the presentation. We always enjoy working with our federal partners, but I want to take a moment to note another very good federal partner we have in the room in Eric Shan with MARAD, the US DOT MARAD. So it's good to have Eric here. With that, we're going to go to the next item on the agenda. It's the Trade Court Enhancement Program. The Commission has been working, the Commission staff and the stakeholders have been working with all of us in developing this program. And as you all know, the California Transportation Commission is responsible for programming and allocating funds for construction on state highways, passenger rail transit, highways, passenger rail transit improvements throughout California. And they've been working under the auspices of SB1 to develop guidelines. And one of those guidelines is for the Trade Court Enhancement Program. With that, I'm going to introduce Scott Hopkins, who is the Deputy Director for Planning from the Commission. Scott.
Thanks, Comey. As Comey mentioned, the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program is one of 5 programs as a result of SB1 that the Commission, CTC, is currently developing guidelines, either has or been adopted and currently developing guidelines for. So the TCEP is one of those programs where we're currently adopting, working on the guidelines. Really, there's no significant update on the TCEP other than I'll give you an overview of where we're at with the development of these draft guidelines since the last CPAC meeting. But at the last TCP workshops, they focused really on the evaluation criteria, the outcomes and outputs of the projects. And Don Chesser at the CTC is preparing a discussion draft of the TCEP guidelines, and those are scheduled to be released in mid-September, and will be the main topic of discussion at the next workshop that is scheduled for September 25th in Sacramento. And really the most significant changes that stakeholders will see to these revised draft guidelines is that the addition of project selection process. And the process will be used by the CTC to select projects that will most likely include high, medium, and low rating for each of the evaluation criteria. And the TRCA uses a similar process, and those guidelines, if you'd like to take a look at them, are on the CalSCA website. We anticipate that the draft TCP guidelines will go before the Commission at the October CTC meeting this year, and this is approximately 2 months ahead of when we initially anticipated that the guidelines would go before the Commission for potential adoption. I can take any comments that you may have now, or also, I suggest you contact Don Chesser at the CTC if you have, you can send her an email if you have any specific comments on what's going on regarding those the guidelines. That's all I have.
Questions for Garth? I imagine most of you have been involved in the process with Don, so maybe most of you are already satisfied with the process and had your questions answered over time. Because even before SB1, the Commission has been working on the freight guidelines for a little bit, so they're a little bit ahead of the curve of getting those ready. So thank you for the presentation. I want to note that we have the man in charge of the largest Caltrans district just walked in while we were having a session here. John Beliski is in the room, the district director of District 8, and he goes around bragging that he has the largest Caltrans district too. Is it true? Yeah, okay. While I'm introducing Jahan, I also want to note that we have the folks I call my fellow AB4 sister agencies. Heather Arias is here from the RV, Larry Rivera is here from CEC, and we have James Epperson from Highway Patrol. So it's good to always have my fellow state agencies supporting us in this effort. With that, we're going to move on to the next item, and I expect this to be a little bit of an interesting discussion because it has to do with projects. Somehow when you start to talk about projects, people pay attention. And just to note, if you are in need of any refreshments besides just water and coffee, there's ample provisions made by Dr. Wolf and and the SBCT staff for you all. So we thank them for that. Being reminded that when you speak into the microphone to get very close to the microphone, and because folks on the webcast can't hear you. All right. Thanks for that, Elaine. So with that, I'm going to call on Chris Schmidt. Oh, I thought he skipped.
Left time. So whenever you get in with Ray, then I usually get the brunt of that later, so I appreciate that. So a lot of what we've already talked about at the meeting today is about projects, and it's about funding, and it's trying to identify, what are good projects, what are the right projects. So that's kind of what I want to walk you through here with the presentation. If we could get the right slide up, like the first one would be helpful. So at a previous meetings, we've talked quite a bit about the fact that, the way the guidelines are coming from SB1, that the state has a certain role in identifying key projects that we would like to put forward. Similar to the conversation we had on the federal funds for Fast Lane and now with infra, what are the priorities at the state level? And what we've tried to do historically is, and Coma has expressed this pretty well, that there's no secret about the nature of the projects that we need. They're the ones that we've been working on for a number of years, and we've really not had the funding to necessarily get them delivered. And now that we've got new guidelines and different funding opportunities at both the state and federal level, the question really is, how do we make a determination strategically to bring some projects forth that we can all hopefully agree on? And frankly, we want your input. That's what the whole point of CFAC is to really help guide and shape what those projects should be. So with that in mind, this is kind of a presentation to kind of walk through the way we're thinking about this and get your feedback on what you think of that approach. So today we want to talk a little bit about what are those key California priorities. We want to talk about key freight projects that we've all known about, that we've submitted for funding in the past, maybe haven't been successful, but want to key on those key projects. Talk a little bit about the funding programs themselves. We mentioned earlier the INFRA program and the competitive nature of that. As mentioned, $1.5 billion. Normally, the state is the beneficiary of roughly 10% of federal funds available, so that's $150 million. Ms. Inman has made it pretty clear that we should get like maybe 40% of that money, so that would be a significantly larger share. And then under the Trade Corridor program, the Commission is discussing, the amount of programming capacity that they'd like to program in the early stages of that program. We've heard, a couple of different scenarios, but fundamentally that could be a couple of years worth of funding with $300 million in play. That's $600 million. And then in addition to that, we've got several years of the formula freight dollars from the federal formula funds that are also in play for programming. So we're looking at almost $1 billion of programmable capacity potentially coming forward to the Commission under these guidelines that we're discussing. So with that in mind, what projects should we put forward as the state? And when we say state, I think we mean collectively, not just individually as regional partners and agencies or as Caltrans, but really collectively as a whole to really achieve the right outcomes. I'm far away from the clicking device here. So the plans, we don't make decisions just out of thin air just because we have a favorite project. We have plans. We've done a number of those. We obviously have the California Transportation Plan, which outlines some of the strategies and vision for the state. We've most recently done the California Sustainable Freight Plan, which is really a lens through which to view the freight plan that we've done prior to that, which includes the mobility plan that we're updating, and we'll have a discussion later on the agenda about that. We're also in the throes of putting out the state rail plan. We also have an interregional transportation strategy. The regions have their own regional transportation plans. Lots of studies have been done in various corridors to prioritize projects. So the point here is we do an awful lot of planning. And we already know where our greatest needs are. We've evaluated a lot of scenarios and set a lot of priorities for ourselves. These broader vision for what we want for California is being articulated through SB1 and the guidelines, but we have principles also in the Sustainable Freight Plan. We have goals in the CTP as well as the CFMP. We have lots of objectives and strategies by which to get there. And so ultimately we need to apply all of that to figure out, what projects should we prioritize? How do we really look at the needs that we have and then how to actually select something and bring those forward? So, that's based on some criteria that are going to come out of the guidelines themselves that are articulated in SB1 in particular and also in federal law. But then there's also some data-driven decision-making that we can be doing. Where do we have the greatest need? Where do we have the best return on investment? And then more importantly, or also very importantly, how do we engage affected stakeholders at the community level? As Ms. Inman pointed out earlier, had a lot of feedback about that at the Freight Symposium. There's a lot of communities that have been disproportionately affected by the freight industry. And there's concern about how those funds should come to those communities to perhaps right some wrongs that they've experienced over time. So within the California Freight Mobility Plan, which is really the document that many of you helped craft and get adopted several years ago, we talk about a number of factors that we should consider. We should talk about economic competitiveness, safety, and security. We want to make sure we have the preservation of the existing system, that we're good environmental stewards, that we really focus on congestion relief, and this is not for the sake of just building more capacity to move more stuff, but recognizing, acknowledging that there is congestion on the system. It does have negative effects. How do we address that congestion? And then innovative technologies and practices that all the industries can put in play. Through the Sustainable Freight Action Plan development, it became pretty clear that there are a number of inefficiencies in the system. There are inefficiencies that are largely beyond the control of any single player in this system of systems. So you may be doing a bang-up job in the way you run your logistics facility or your trucking company, or the way you produce goods and services that you bring to customers. But as you hand off what you produce, there may be some inefficiencies. So that's what we're talking about here. And within that lens that I mentioned earlier on the Sustainable Freight Action Plan, we set out some specific things that we're trying to achieve through some targets. We want to achieve some system efficiency. We've talked about this 25% efficiency goal. We've talked about transitioning to zero-emission equipment, really to bring greenhouse gas emissions down, and also to make sure we're investing in those communities, as I mentioned earlier, that have experienced maybe some of the more deleterious effects of the freight industry. And we want to make sure we focus on increased competitiveness overall and make sure that we're focused on the economy and jobs. So having said that, what projects are out there? Well, it turns out we just worked with the Commission to help update the list of projects in the Freight Mobility Plan. There are approximately 1,000 projects listed in that plan of various sorts. Obviously, not all those projects are equal, so how do we evaluate those? Earlier were some questions about the pilots. We have 3 pilots teed up that came out of the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. We've previously submitted fast lane applications from all over the state and had only been had limited success, as was pointed out as well. And so how do we make sure that we look at those projects, because clearly they were identified and very important to those that submitted them. How do we leverage those? We have an interregional transportation plan on the state side that largely guides where the ITIP dollars have traditionally been invested. The Commission had to delay some projects due to lack of funding, and so there's an opportunity to bring some of those projects back forward. And then there's also some priorities set by the governor relative to grade separations and infrastructure at the border. So all of this is kind of in play, and we're trying to have a broad view here, recognizing that every player may have a slightly narrower interest. So fast lane cycle that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we did, and maybe just to help explain the process a little bit, was that, at that time, any entity could only submit 3 projects. And so we kind of had a call for projects through the department, asking our district directors to work with their regional partners to try to identify those projects that made the most sense for the department to participate on, specifically to nominate and submit for funding. We did that, and in the first cycle, as you recall, we had one project that was successful, the SR11 Enrique Fermi project at Otay Mesa East POE, which was a relatively modest award of $49 million. That was not 10% of the program dollars available at that time, which should have been roughly around $100 million. So a little lesson learned there. A number of you have had debriefs. We've heard all sorts of things relative to who should sponsor a project, the nature of the project, and you heard the latest on the infra grant. The criteria are changing and things are going to be becoming increasingly competitive relative to leveraging those federal dollars. Clicker's a long way away here. So the projects that the department identified through the process of calling for those projects were 3 of them. The American Global Freight Gateway Project, with really a partnership with the Southern California districts from Caltrans, SCAG, and LA Metro, to try to identify some key corridors and key investments in Southern California. We also identified a project on State Route 99, the Target 6 Lanes Widening Project, that really was only going to be sponsored by Caltrans given its location, and the Stockton Railroad Project. So those are the three that we identified, and this is more for a point of history and kind of where we've been in the past and kind of what we've done thus far. So what we also talked a little bit about was these three pilot projects, and as Ben mentioned, there's a commitment on our part to get these implemented. We want to do that smartly. We want to do that because these are hopefully transformative projects that leverage the types of investments that we think that need to happen throughout the entire freight industry over time. So how can we do that effectively and perhaps push these projects forward so we can grow that capacity within the system? So we certainly have a keen eye on these three projects and making sure that they remain high on the priority list. The new funding sources that I mentioned, I won't belabor this point too much. The prior year funding, the $850 million from 17 and 18, about the $0.5 billion. As I mentioned earlier, through the TCEP program, leveraging those formula federal funds as well as the state funds, roughly about $1 billion might be in budget programming, depending on how the commission decides the number. Beyond the freight funding program, there's also the Congested Corridors program, as well as the state and local partnership program. Each of those programs is several $100 million annually. And so while not all projects are freight projects, all freight projects are transportation projects. And so there's an opportunity to leverage the other fund types to also invest in freight. And that needs to be part of the thought process and part of the conversation. We certainly don't want to forget the fact that this needs to be done in partnership. Not only is that embedded in SB1 in the trailer bill language and also reflective of the guidelines that the Commission is considering, but we obviously have many local measures within the state of California, and there's actually an incentive for local measures within SB1 because those communities that have local funded measure programs can also tap into some of the SLPP funding. So we need to acknowledge the partnering that's necessary to deliver these projects, and that's why this conversation needs to be had. So what kind of criteria are on the table? Well, there's different criteria within INFRA, there's different criteria within TCEP, although in draft form, and they vary a little bit. They're not necessarily exactly the same, so I don't want to walk through the details of this, but recognizing depending on who's handing out the money, if you will, we're going to be having to apply some slightly different criteria to really identify the projects that are going to really key most into that funding category specifically. So you heard a little bit from Tasha early on infra. There's a lot of leveraging here and innovation, a lot of private investment opportunity here potentially, and really the message that we've heard is they want the federal funds to play a pivotal role in making the project happen, that it's sort of like the last dollar necessary to deliver something. That's really a big part of it. On TCEP, you've been through the guideline process. We've had Dawn here. Garth discussed it earlier. It's going to be very inclusive, lots of opportunities for all kinds of projects. And it's going to be, frankly, this is me saying this as a Caltrans staffer watching the process, a challenge for the Commission to be able to really identify the best projects. And so part of this conversation, I think, helps the Commission as well. So if you can read this, you probably did not look at the eclipse. So I'm sorry if you missed that, but it's not meant to be seen or read. What I'm teeing up here is simply what we've been doing with the thousands of projects that are in the CFMP and the projects that we're trying to prioritize, finding a means by which to evaluate these for project readiness, for project delivery capability. Are they pinging against the criteria? Are some of these projects really truly freight projects, the way the current criteria, whether it's infra or it's TCEP, do they really truly qualify and would they play well based on the criteria that have been set out? So that's what we're doing to kind of look at all the projects, both the ones that Caltrans traditionally has been primarily responsible for, sort of what would be the ITIP funded projects, the interregional type projects, but also those on the regional level where we've had strong partnerships to develop projects both on system and then recognizing that there's many projects here that are off system. And so we're not necessarily focusing on a state highway system per se. We want a multimodal approach
We want to make sure that we're doing this, whether it's on the state highway system or not, that we're doing the right project in the right location. So we're just trying to tell you that we're not just sitting around, pulling numbers out of a hat. We're looking at this carefully. So what we've teed up here are some projects that traditionally the department has identified as high priority. The first few that you see there under the category fast lane highway projects, those are the ones that we've been talking about nominating for fast lane and infra grant funding opportunities. The second column is focused on the two projects that have been identified that the department is responsible for, the advanced technologies for truck corridors in Southern California and the advanced technology deployment for the cross-border project. So those are the two sustainable freight projects that we've been keying on and I mentioned earlier. In addition, there are other border infrastructure needs beyond the pilot that we mentioned that's been a focus of this administration to get the infrastructure that's necessary to make cross-border trade more viable and reduce some of the delays. So there's a number of projects there, both in San Diego County as well as Imperial County. And then there's a list of grade separations that, as I mentioned previously, have been a priority of the Brown administration. And with the new state rail plan coming out, I think there's some opportunity to look at some additional rail projects as well. So with that, we've kind of teed up some of these projects by location, by district, by county, what city they're in, the nature of the project. So here's a listing of fast lane and other highway projects that we've been talking about. And again, you don't need to absorb all of this right this second, but just to kind of give you a sense that we're trying to get to some kind of short listing and some priority setting. Here's a list of the pilot projects and kind of the locations of where some of the investments might be made and the nature of what those investments would be, recognizing, again, that we're just scoping this out at this point. Same thing on the border infrastructure. We've had those projects in the queue for a number of years. A number of different investment strategies have been approached, trying to get those projects done. And then on the grade separations, we've had traditionally a list of prioritized grade crossings that need improvement, and some of those have actually been delivered, like Rosecrans, Marquardt. So what are these right projects? How do we take this triangle of state and local plans and the priorities that they articulate and the vision that they set that are driven by the local decision makers, by the community members that are represented there? How do we use those plans to guide the various freight projects that we identify as potential investments? And then how do we align those with the opportunities for the funding programs, which have differing criteria depending on who's providing the funding? So what type of projects should the state put forward? I think we've talked about the fact that we want to put forward multimodal projects and where we can partner. How can we make more, the state more competitive while at the same time also focusing on sustainability? How do we evaluate projects that achieve both? A number of times I've heard the need to really evaluate projects on their ability to really make the state economically more competitive, that an investment in state infrastructure, funded with state dollars, truly has economic outcomes for the state. And then how do we match the priorities to the available funding programs? As I mentioned earlier, we're not just talking about the TCEP or infra, we're really also talking about the other funding programs that are embedded in SB1. How do we leverage those potentials, and recognizing too that the STIP gets a little bit of infusion at the same time. And then hopefully we're making data-driven decisions that are defensible, accountable, et cetera. SB1 wants to be transparent and very accountable to the taxpayer. That program is still under some scrutiny, and so we want to really identify the best projects that are really achieving the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and then prove to the taxpayer that we're good stewards of those dollars. So how do we do all those things within this sort of broad context? That's a lot to absorb and try to muddle through and think through, but that's kind of what this conversation today is intended to do. So I just wanted to put this out there as a means by which to think about this, and then recognizing that probably all of you have your favorite projects, have your urgent needs. How do we talk about those, and then how do we collectively partner? So with that, I'll turn it over to Kome to facilitate some questions.
Well, thank you, Chris. I think hopefully you all appreciate the thought process behind that presentation. It really was intended to begin to have, I think as we've tried to continue to have adult conversations about what are the real freight projects. And if we can't talk about real freight projects at CFAC, where would you have that conversation? And maybe beyond that is to begin to identify ways to actually mark what those freight projects look like. We are at a point, I think when we started the CFAC many moons ago, funding was a really big deal. And in fact, it was almost insurmountable. We just couldn't figure out where the money was going to be. And that was always at the forefront of everybody's mind is we got a lot to do and there's not enough money. We still have a lot to do. There is some money. In fact, I think we have an unprecedented amount of funds available, both at the federal and state level, dedicated to freight. It didn't used to be that way. While there is a lot more money, there's still not enough to do everybody's project. So it still requires us to think through how we prioritize and how we are prudent in picking the right projects. And so what we're trying to do is, what are the data-driven approaches, what are the objective approaches to picking projects that are meaningful to freight as we would like to see freight grow, both in terms of impact on the economy and efficiency, and also footprint in terms of the environment, but also make sure that we're not making capricious decisions. There are some subjective issues that are involved that we all know we have to grapple with. It's still a large state. There's still going to be a need to be to recognize some geographic issues. But for the most part, when you talk about freight, the geography of freight is very precise, and I think the opening presentation that Ray had sort of is instructive in that respect. So you would notice that a lot of our data-driven approach has led to projects in certain areas of the state, as it were. So that's really just a primer on how we've gone through determining projects, and I think hopefully it's not a surprise to most people, but let's have a conversation about that. And I just want to note that I really appreciate Kerry. I pick on him a lot, and he's good for it, but he's always very thoughtful and well prepared, so I appreciate him being part of this committee. So, Kerry, you're up first. Then
Thank you,
Madonna.
Comey. That was very sweet of you. Thank you. Since we only have, in terms of infra, 8 weeks left, I'm hopeful that soon the state can reaffirm their commitment to their actual 3 submittals, and I see the 1 on there still, and I would assume then that we could move forward with that. Caltrans being the submitting agency as they were before. And I know that LA Metro has some modifications they want to make to the highway components. Specifically, they want to add some components for their I-710, some early action projects. So it's hoped that we can confirm that, as with San Bernardino County TA and RCTC, as we know other participants, that we confirm that Caltrans will be the submitting agency for the Southern California Gateway Highway Program, as well as our Ports Rail program that Caltrans should provide a support letter, endorsement letter. So hopefully we can nail that down soon. And then just a comment, I think it would be prudent for the agencies to resubmit their list of freight projects for hopefully eventual inclusion in an updated CFMP. It's been 4 or 5 years since we submitted our list. Many things have changed, particularly for the ports in terms of priorities. Just structural changes in the ocean freight business has also resulted in changed priorities for us to some extent. But so we'd hope that solicitation of project lists will be done soon to also help guide the TCEP process beyond infra. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. LaDonna?
So it was a great presentation, and I may be too late, but I was wondering if you could bring it back up. I wanted to go back to a slide because it was a lot of information to run through. But I think it was slide 13, 12, 13. I couldn't read the one that has all the TCEP criteria on it. So for those of us who haven't totally followed it, I wanted to understand some of the distinctions of the changes that we might see in TCEP compared to what we previously worked on TCIF. And there was something on that slide I wanted to try to catch.
They're bringing it up.
It was a good presentation.
That one.
What are the screening criteria? That was kind of my question. But two questions. What are the screening criteria, and what are the main distinctions between the two programs?
So Dawn's not here, so I'm not going to put Garth on the spot to try to explain this. But in developing the criteria and having walked through the TCIF guidance and then trying to absorb both the SB1 details
just
and the
basic,
trailer bill.
Sorry, basic distinction. You're asking what are the difference between the two? The infra is federal, the TCP is state. Okay.
TCIF.
Okay.
So yeah, and that's the line of answer I was going for. So there are some differences. So TCIF, the way the bond program work does look different than the TCEP program, and there are some marked differences between what SB1 specifically required, although similar to what was in the original Prop 1B proposed program under TCIF, as well as the trailer bill language that Ben referred to earlier. And so that is what Dawn has been incorporating into the guidelines, that it is different than what was in TCIF. And you'll have to do a little crosswalk, and Dawn, I think, could do a better job of identifying specifically where those differences lie. The intent is generally the same, but there are some specifics that are a little bit more nuanced, some things about community impacts and sustainability language and things like that. So.
I can respond to the screening criteria. There's a couple, like the project must be awarded.
Get closer to the mic, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's a couple, like the project must be awarded for construction by December 31st, 2022. And that was for the CFIP. So these can change a little bit. So the latest guidelines is in the CTC website. There's a couple other ones, like the project has to be in the CFMP or an RTP. Projects, they also have to meet the objectives of the program. There are other projects, like they have to contribute to the to coordinate basin emission reductions and stimulate the economy, enhance travel value. So there's they're listed in the guidelines.
Thanks, Jose. So I have four hands up. We'll start with Heather, Nidia, and then Tina and Ian. Okay, that order.
Thanks, Comey. Thanks, Chris. I think from our perspective, of course, we are very interested in pushing those very innovative projects forward. Certainly on our side of the house, we're pushing for that advanced technology. We know that in the action plan, the guiding principles talk about meeting the efficiency and the environmental impacts. We would highlight those guiding principles and suggest that they be a top priority for picking the projects. Certainly, we would also suggest that very specific criteria is identified, including which data sources and how those data sources are used, especially in the stakeholder process. I don't want to steal Nidia's thunder, but certainly she's a great resource, and the other community members for part of your process question about getting out and speaking to those stakeholders who are going to be directly impacted by this. So encourage you to work with her and the rest of the Freight Coalition on that. But really just for all of us around the table, as well as the community members, just very clearly articulating what criteria you're going to use and then what data is going to be applied. So then essentially folks have the opportunity to say, yeah, that's either the right criteria or not. Do we have better data that you should be using or not? And then how that's actually applied to the list so that we can all work together to see which projects fall out up on top and how it's being applied. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I think in sport terminology that would be called a layup. I think I'm going to speak specifically to the fact that looking at the advanced technology corridors at border ports of entry, one of the things that letters coming to you, Mr. Eric Fredericks, tomorrow, is specifically on the air quality tracking. Right now, it's not mentioned as part of the advanced technology evaluation. So because community groups are actually a lot more savvy and inherently understand data because it's impacting them daily. One of the things we were looking at is whether or not there's an evaluation for some of these phases. Right now, we know that in pilots, there's an inherent evaluation plan, but we don't see that as far as the work plan. So we'd like to understand what that's going to be, and then also suggest that a community advisory committee be introduced specifically in the areas at the border ports of entry. We can put you in touch with some of our partners in that community that have air quality monitoring, that have feasibility studies, that do, truck counts, et cetera, that I think will really be beneficial as a stakeholder in that group process. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
I just want to chime in. This is Ben from the Transportation Agency. I think the comments about the air quality monitoring is great. Glad you brought that up because there are other bodies in state government where we talk about this stuff and may not have the nexus here, but there's the California-Mexico Border Relations Council, and our agency participates in that conversation. It's chaired by the Secretary of the Environmental Protection Agency, and we have a lot of conversations about the air monitoring going on and the deployment and the progress that's been made in that area. So I think we want to definitely connect the pilots in terms of that work being done and whether or not these pilots can help reduce some of the air or improve the air quality down there. So thank you.
So we'll go to Tina, Ian, and then Larry.
Yeah, it's clear that everything is still being discussed, but to LaDonna's question, some of us were talking this morning at the MPO side that there was an interest in maintaining some of those original outcomes, which had to do with safety, velocity, throughput, reliability, congestion reduction, and emissions reduction. That a lot of thought went into that. I think there's what's open for lots of discussion is there weighting with those? Are they weighted high, medium, and low? Are those primary criteria followed by a set of secondary criteria? And then definitely we've been talking with the stakeholders at the guidelines group is that the CalBC tool be modified to be more sensitive to the environmental analytics. So that's just kind of things that are on the table, but I think it's been affirmed, right, Ben, that CalBC is being modified by both Caltrans and CARB.
That's correct. So CalBC is being worked on as we speak.
Could you speak more broadly about that, because I think not everybody is familiar with CalBC.
So CalBC is the cost-benefit model that the department has used for 20, 30 years. In fact, was developed in-house and has grown in its use, and it's recognized nationally as a cost-benefit tool. To Ms. Inman's earlier question, maybe our tool is too sharp and we're causing ourselves some self-inflicted damage at the national level. So we're updating that tool to be reflective of some of what Tina pointed out, specifically some health benefits, some air quality breakouts. That work is underway. We want that tool to be available by the end of this calendar year, so all of you who have used it traditionally can walk through it, make sure the numbers still look the way you think they should look for the projects that you've traditionally run through there. And then I think the intent is to furnish CalBC outputs as part of the nomination of projects to the commission so they can be evaluated for each project.
Thank you. Ian?
Great, thank you very much. Ian McMillan with South Coast AQMD. It's my first time attending this. I very much appreciate letting me sit in on this, and this is a very helpful presentation to hear, as well as all the others. I just actually had a quick question on this. The pilot project for Southern California, there's a lot of components to that. One of those components is the near zero emission drayage truck pilot. Would that component be eligible under SB1? Since it's not actually concrete, right, and building a roadway. And maybe you don't know the answer.
Well, I'm going to forge an answer for you because I want to make sure you're satisfied. That's my job. So you'll come back. No, I think one of the things to note, we always have this conundrum with funding with fuel-based taxes. There's a limit in the Constitution on what you could do. So typically, you can build infrastructure, but you can't build rolling stock with those funds. So there will be elements of that program where you're installing facilities that could be eligible for funding in some of the state-funded programs. But then you can pair that with other fund sources to be able to do the rolling stock element of it. I think we have a very, very deliberate policy that we want to bring about 100,000 near zero emission vehicles into the system, into the freight system, over a period of time on the Sustainable Freight Action Plan. So that's going to be over a concert of different fund sources, some of which maybe Larry might want to speak to.
Comey referred to it as a conundrum, and I think, quite frankly, it's an opportunity. Let me do real quickly, not just in response to you, Ian, but I think some of the views and opportunities with respect to the Commission on not just the sustainable freight projects, but you consider going forward and, for lack of a better, the projects that were proposed in the CFMP, if you add another lens to this, and that is this. With respect to the advanced technology deployments, in particular ITS, the Energy Commission has been investors in this area in the last 2 cycles, funding cycles. We continue to be active in some of the engagements. We have active projects with Kerry in the Port of LA and down in San Diego as well, with Freightus and some connected vehicle technologies. That will continue for a while underneath one of our funding programs. The other area I want to highlight is not just the advanced technology deployments. We need to pay attention and look at the opportunities, if you will, to fund the infrastructure for those technologies. I think that's been sort of sidebar, if you will, not been part of the critical TCO, the cost analysis, if you will, the total cost of ownership for these technology deployments. And I think as you look at these projects, perhaps fold that into either the innovative folder or look at potentially some mitigation funds for that area. Additionally, I think that there's an opportunity to leverage the dollars and the efforts that will be coming out of the SB 350, the transportation electrification investments by the utilities throughout the state. And we will soon see the publicly owned utilities such as LADWP and sort of their cut at infrastructure development. So those are my 3 thoughts.
Thank you, Larry. Again, like I said, it's always good to have the state sister agencies around here. Commissioner Inman.
I want to circle back a couple of things. One, when we look at our various plans that we listed there, I think because the sector represents public-private partnerships, we need to have some methodology to somehow consider where the private investments are going, because, you know, whether it's public-private with our port dollars or our Class 1 railroads, and then, you know, just the whole transload portion of the system of systems are private investments. So somehow for us to at least be aware of where because those investments are part of this integrated system of systems. But really I want to go back, and it kind of goes to Mike's question about the matching funds and being eligible for whatever precious federal dollars come. I'm really hung up on the fact that we haven't done well. You guys can tell. But I would match our state against any other state in the nation in terms of self-help dollars. I'm not aware of any other state that helps themselves more than we help ourselves. And we also have non-attainment air districts. We have the heaviest lift when it comes to figuring out, you know, having dense freight corridors and heavily populated corridors and topography. You know, Wayne Nastry from our air district has proposed, you know, some kind of a super fund, like help us out here to get this. But I think somehow to at least be able for us to get some credit for what we all collectively are doing to help ourselves. You know, we're leading the nation in the cap and trade scenario, and so somehow we don't get credit for that. And I don't know if it's a marketing communication problem for us, but I don't think it's okay that we don't get a way that, number one, we don't get penalized for the fact that we're, doing a whole bunch of other stuff. So maybe it's a communications problem for us, but somehow we have a ton of private investment here. We have, we're cutting edge when it comes to our emission reduction. We still have to go further. We're doing a lot, so I don't know who the best person was, and maybe that's, Office of the Secretary question at USDOT. But to the extent there will perhaps be any kind of an infrastructure program, I think we're going to have to, whatever we're doing isn't working in terms of getting any help.
I would agree, and I'm glad that one of my federal agencies have sort of signed in. Well, I think there's no question that we can qualify our projects to be the most efficient in terms of energy, in terms of environmental impact, in terms of freight capacity and velocity. We can qualify a lot of our projects to be the best in the country. I've just boiled it down to the fact that we only have 2 senators out of 100. And so that tends to play across the country where they may not have the same sensitivities, but they also have 2 senators. And so there's that equalizer that sort of takes the wind out of all of what we might do here, which is unfortunate. But given that, I think maybe the one thing to take away that's positive is the relentless effort that we've put into helping shape national policy and having you on the National Freight Policy Board. I think it pays off to the extent that we've seen some of the things that we're doing in California begin to bleed into the national scene. So I think we just have to be relentless and continue to be advocates until we get some of our criteria into the mix on this grant programs. Otherwise, we'll not be successful. I think Tina was first, and then Eric. Or do you want to speak to Eric? Do you want to speak to what Fran just said? Why don't you do that, and then we'll go to Tina.
Sure, Tina. Let me cut in line. And Eric Shen from Maritime Administration. And just based on my observation of the last 2 grant application process, with the caveat that many of us out in the field, we were not part of the review process. But based on what the feedback we received from headquarters, a couple of things I would share, or at least pointers I will provide to this group as a consideration. One is when all is equal, you have to make sure your application is clearly articulated and as concise as you can. And you have to be able to pass the very first round of technical review team. And that is, you have to assume the technical review team, many of them they are pulled from rank and file like myself, who are not familiar with California. Many of them may not understand what the term self-help is. And therefore, it is very important when you utilize vocabularies, you need to assume that you're talking to a person who is from East Coast that has very little understanding of your own contribution. And make sure that it is explained well, and so that you are able to pass the very first cut. Secondly, is do your homework. Really study all of the guidelines that are published. I think on the screen earlier, several times you already see the word leveraging. It is a clear hint that in your application, you need to reflect on what the infra grant is looking for. And you need to speak in the language that the reviewer is willing and able to latch onto, so that you're not being filtered out and not even passed to the second round. And then thirdly, just do your homework. If there are support letters needed, make sure you aggressively pursue support letters, and they do matter. Never let up. If you don't, and there are plenty of agencies who support and who seek aggressive support letters from their representatives. So those are the things that you must do to stay competitive. And then the rest really is just how the system will play out that goes above our pay grade.
Thanks. Tina, I think those are excellent points, and I think I hope everybody's taking notes because all the things that Eric mentioned have sort of come out in the various debriefs that we've had, and they're important things to note. Now, ultimately, I think it's going to be a lot of PR and selling of the project, so people can. It's not selling in the negative sense, but make people more familiar with the elements of your project, such that they can understand the benefits you're trying to attain with those projects. Tina, then we'll go to Marnie.
Yeah, Eric makes a good point because we've always had a debrief on failed projects with the feds, and we finally figured out that when we put up the Rancho Penasquitos project, nobody knew what we were talking about. It just sounded too foreign, and they said they had trouble understanding it. So remember, you're talking to somebody in D.C. But another point is I appreciate Chris's tour de force, look in the rearview mirror of everything that's done. It kind of has helped me see, I think, where you want to go to get the state freight plan pulled together. If I'm reading correctly, that the funding resources on the table is going to help you winnow down this list of constrained projects, because it's going to be what we can pay for with the federal and state funds combined. Yes, I'm seeing yes. And I think that's great. And then the remaining 1,000 projects or whatever stay on an unconstrained list. So very similar to what all the MPOs do. But I think Fran has raised a really good point where we need to continue to emphasize the importance of the sunk investment in the freight infrastructure here that's already been paid for with a large use of public and private dollars. And that's one thing we do include in our constrained freight plan, projects that are paid for not out of public resources, because that's part of the infrastructure too. And I think it'll be a big project to get our arms around that private investment that's in this state, but I'm sure it's going to far supersede any other state's investment in freight infrastructure. And maybe that's a way to better tell the California story, rather than having the federal government look at California as a self-help state and say, well, they already took care of the problem, so we'll go somewhere else with our resources. So just kind of thinking out loud, but I think that's a great idea, Fran. And we could catalog those assets and make a point about really, we do a really good job with leveraging, and we perhaps don't tell that well enough sometimes.
Thank you. So I think, first of all, Fran, as always, distilling that golden nugget that we all need to hear. But I would just add, we bring a knife to a gunfight. We are ignoring the anywhere but California uphill battle that we have. Comey referenced the fact that we only have 2 senators. Well, the I-95 corridor has a coalition along the East Coast that brings dozens of senators to the table. So what are we doing to counter those types of alliances? We have the I-15 corridor where we could reach out to Nevada and do. Is there a project that we could be co-sponsoring with other states? The I-5 corridor has both the border crossing in the south, and then the corridor for Oregon and Washington in the north. So are there efforts that we could be taking with those states to bring ourselves to the table in a multi-state position? And I see lots of head shaking, so hopefully there's some response to that. But I've asked before, Comey, and I'll just ask again, can we get someone to come and talk to this group from a strategic standpoint about how this state is presenting itself in Washington, D.C. for competing for federal funding, so that we can give you the benefit of the insights that we all have? Most of the agencies sitting around this table have their individual lobbyists, and they're going to lobby for their own respective projects, and as well they should. And when it comes down to it, if you have to get into a dogfight over funding, you will. But what are we doing collectively as a state to put our own California best foot forward, knowing that there are 49 other states that want to eat our lunch, and they're doing a pretty damn good job of it?
So let me respond real quick. This is Coco with Caltrans Sacramento. That's a really good point, and I think it's a great reminder that we do have coalitions that we're participating, multi-state coalitions. We have the I-10 coalition. It's one that we've just started recently with the other states, and you mentioned the I-15. So it's a good reminder to dust off those conversations that we've been having and see what projects also are ready to add to the list that Chris kind of put forward. I know I was recently in a conversation with some folks on the I-10, and that's exactly what we were talking about. Do we have anything that's ready? Do we have anything that's ready for this round of infra? If not this time, let's be ready for the next round. So excellent points. So thank you for that reminder.
And Comey, at the risk of upsetting you, one of the things that we've talked about as staff, I want to be really clear on this, is there an opportunity for a single consensus California package to submit to Washington so that the full weight of everyone's support is behind that, so it is not a split, bifurcated kind of nomination, but we all say, yes, these truly are our highest, most urgent needs, where we can leverage, where we can and need that federal participation to make these happen. And I've heard different thoughts on that, including that's never going to happen. To, well, I don't know how we have that conversation given the size and nature of the state with the difference of opinion about what's important. So I just throw that out there. That's also a means by which to do that for infra, but that's probably only going to work for infra, certainly not for the other fund types.
Yes, I hear you, Marnie. We'll put that on the list of to-do in terms of strategic conversation on how we posit our projects before a national audience. And I think a number of people have noted that. We've gotten a lot of feedback, enough to be able to make sense of what sells across the country. I still think there's just not enough resources at the federal level for us to deal with. I mean, the infra program is looking for 20% federal participation. It used to be in the old days, we expected the federal government to come to the table with 90% money. So I think the dynamics have shifted, and we have to make compelling cases on our projects. All right, it looks like we have no other questions from committee members. Are there any questions from the members of the public that are not committee members? Seeing none, we'll then move on to the next item. That will be Raul's item.
All right. So I'll get closer to the mic.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm ready. And so I have a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint
is not ready.
Is right there.
There you go.
All right. That's for advancing. All right. So this was a presentation on California Freight Mobility Plan. We have some things to share with you. We all know, this is one of the plans which has a project list, unlike some other plans that Caltrans works on. So it's very important. It's very very relevant for all of us, especially given the discussion we had on freight and priorities and projects, and highlighting the need for investment in infrastructure. This is kind of, as Caltrans, we see this as our marketing tool, right? This is our marketing tool for identifying and prioritizing freight at a statewide level. So today I'm going to briefly talk about the project list update exercise that we did for CTC, and that was for the target calculation, reasonable geographic targets. We're also going to talk about a little bit an update on the addendum that we are required to prepare for Fast Act compliance. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the CFMP 2019, which is a full update required by the state and federal regulations every 5 years. And then the need for a freight data working group that we, have been discussing over the last an hour and a half. So it's actually necessary that we have a group like that at a statewide level. So quickly, the update on the exercise we did.
So we at Caltrans were asked by CTC to approach all the regional agencies, which we did, all the MPOs and RTPAs. And, we know the CFMP 2014 that's approved has 707 projects. So we wanted to see what's been constructed, what's been eliminated, what's been added, right? So we did a pretty intensive exercise with all the MPOs, and thank you for all your feedback, timely feedback, and Excel sheets. Huge copy-pasting exercise, but at the end of it, we realized we have 312 projects added. So that's like adding about 100 projects every year, right? Even though we are constructing about, say, 81 projects over the last 3 years. So it's a huge list. Not all of them are freight projects, kind of, they're infrastructure project that helps freight, but not exactly. So we have 953 projects right now. And then the CTC will do its number crunching and figure out how they calculate the reasonable geographic targets for the regions. So with that humongous list, we definitely need to have a strategy to prioritize projects, right? So that's one need that we have. And then the second item I wanted to cover was the addendum that we are preparing at Caltrans. And this is required for federal dollars only, federal formula dollars, not infra, or it's not a requirement for state dollars either, but it is something, it's required by the feds. We are working on it. We had certain webinars presented by Medtrans. So the report will be out very soon, probably in a month. We will send it out for your review. For the critical rural urban freight corridor designation, which is kind of also a part of funding eligibility for formula dollars, freight formula dollars, national, federal level. So we have a process in place. We haven't rolled it out yet because there are other things going on. So we plan to start that corridor nomination process. And again, these are those these are not really corridors. These are segments of roadways which are more like the last mile connections to freight facilities that need to be designated if your project is not already on the primary highway freight system, which is identified and adopted by Congress. So we have a technical working group. About 25 agencies are participating in it. So we met like 6-7 times over the last year or so. So we have a process in place. Just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of it. We have presented this in the previous CFAC meetings. So we will be rolling that process pretty soon. The third item, which is required by the feds, is a freight investment plan, which is pretty much a list of projects once they are selected after the TSIP Trade Corridor Enhancement Program guidelines has been adopted. So that would be May 2018 timeframe. So that's why our federal compliance is being delayed by about 5 months. And, we have informed Tasha, and she's okay with it. Next, we want to cover a little bit of the details. These are quotes from the Federal Register. And let me read. It's kind of slightly, font size is a little tiny, but so the second bullet, which says, the third bullet, prioritization of freight projects within a state freight plan is now mandatory. So that clearly says that we need a process to be in place to make sure that we collectively come up with some process. So the plan is not just a policy plan. It's not just a list of projects, but it is a prioritized list of projects. So we want to emphasize that. And maybe in the interest of time, I'll just skip. I think the last bullet is also important, that whenever we are doing assessments of bottlenecks or issues that we have in the system, it should be that the assessment should be done at a state and MPO level. So I think CFAC is a very great opportunity to talk about what are those issues and how do we prioritize our needs. especially given the fact that we have 953 projects in the list. So some other specifics from the Federal Register is that it has to be multimodal. It has to look at the 5-year forecast, as well as they encourage us to look at a long-term horizon. And then they do mention innovative technologies. That's the 5th bullet. They do talk about strategies to be in place, to be listed in the freight plan. So these are content requirement for the freight mobility plan. So how do you drill down 900 projects into something more tangible and relatable, like 100 projects? What are those top 100 or top 20 and so on? So this is kind of reference material for you, taken from the Federal Register. Again, the role of CFAC, or the Freight Advisory Committee, is listed in the Federal Register. So just as a reminder that, again, we really encourage that participation while we develop. And why I'm saying this is because we have this, we are rolling it out. We are rolling a contract with the consultant, working closely with Caltrans to do a 5-year full update. So CFMP 2014, and then now we will be working on 2019. And it's a federal and state requirement. So we have selected consultant with Ferrin Pierce, HDR, Tioga, EDR, Kurt and Pringle, and then some academics. So it's a great team. We want to make sure that our freight plan is the best in the nation, right? We'll do our best. We have a short time frame between September 2017 to approximately September 2019. So in 2 years, we want to make sure that we develop a freight plan which really reflects the collective effort that we can put in, the information, and it has to be as comprehensive as possible. And then it has to lay the groundwork for attracting more federal funds, as we discussed, into California, make the system more efficient, safe, reliable, our communities, less impacted, and air quality better, and so on. So that's given, right? The policy side of it. But when we talk about projects, right, we need to develop some form of a working group. So, and I think this was discussed in the last CFAC meeting, that why don't, Caltrans could probably take a lead in developing a team together, like a working group, when it comes to data and data crunching to identify needs or develop priorities or solutions. And frankly, because of the SB1 requirement on transparency, for compliance and accountability, before and after studies. So data really helps us, convey a lot of good stories. So we are really, this is kind of the push that we have, that let's try to get together a group of individuals who are familiar with, some of these data, which, the federal website lists tons of data with rail, maritime, safety, air traffic, community impacts. So that's federal data source related to freight on the first column. And the draft TCEP guidelines does have some outputs and outcomes. So we know we have some data source, we know what we are wanting to measure and the outcomes we want at the end of the day. So the whole goal is data-driven decision making that Chris alluded to earlier. So consistent mechanism statewide, right? I mean, can we do that? And at least we should hope for having that. Led by Caltrans in a way that it's transparent and it's relatable. This is a brief list of the outcomes and outputs, along with some of the data that Caltrans is familiar with. I mean, this is not a exhaustive list. There's tons of extra source of information out there. So we started working on listing, and I think some of you had mentioned that, what data source we should use, what metrics, and how do we measure it, what's the methodology. So we can start working on something like that. So we want to kind of seek your feedback as to, do these make sense? I mean, do you need different kinds of data? We don't need all answers today, right? We don't have enough time. But the idea is to have a group of technical experts who can dwell more deep into these and figure out what works and what doesn't work and what we should, as a state, be doing. The next slide actually kind of, it's a little bit hard to read, but the idea is, at the end of the day, we have a prioritized list of projects to the right. But the way we do it is either through problem identification, where we know we have congestion and safety issues and so on, or a project benefit, which is already a list of projects that we have, right? So we already have a list of projects, and we also know the congestion issues from a purely like analytical point of view. So how do we combine them into a list of prioritized projects? So it could be like, like an unconstrained list or a constrained list of freight priority projects at the end of the day. So that's where we are in Caltrans. This is how we are thinking of approaching this to make it more transparent and consistent statewide. Some of it really makes sense to us, but we want to really seek your feedback. And before I close, I just wanted to pitch in this slide that it's a huge state. We all know it. We have huge populations in the north and south. We have a lot of urbanizing areas, and a lot of that yellow that you see, there's a lot of agriculture and farm. It's not like nobody lives there, right? But there is freight there too, right? And we have a lot of local community impacts from freight. We have jobs at a regional level. We have international border crossing and ports. So that's our context. We all know that. But this is how Caltrans looks at it, the whole state as a whole, not individual regions. So can we develop a system with with this in mind, that let's have a working group together, and then so we want to kind of seek your input as to how we can develop a team together, looking at the more data side of project prioritization. A couple of next things we have working in the pipeline is, we, of course, have the CFAC meetings, hopefully every quarter. Sometimes we do thrice in a year, but we are hoping to have 4 times in a year. We will have the critical corridor ongoing designations rolling out pretty soon. And that's a rolling designation process, which many of us are familiar with. But more importantly, the working group, freight data working group, that we are proposing. So that's our intent here, right? To form a group, a team together, meet every quarter, develop some strategies, and kind of go forward. So that's my presentation, and I can probably have Chris or Kome lead the discussion and questions.
Oh, the questions are coming to you. But I think you made Phil happy when you showed that yellow map, right? Not very happy. I was hoping you made you happy. I think Kerry had a question.
Yeah, just a couple comments. First, basic question, just to confirm, the consultant effort that you're undertaking is to assist you for the 2019 freight plan?
Correct.
Okay. Just a couple of the high-level comments. One on the prioritization. My understanding is that prioritization only needs to be to satisfy the federal requirements is for the $550 million approximately NHFP fund, which is now $360 because our good friend Tina gets a little piece of that already. So that's going to be very easy to identify prioritization with the remaining $360 million. Secondly, in terms of assessing, the needs and these performance measures, I would like to say, I've said this before, is in Southern California, you have what you need already. It's been done for years, and it's continuing to be done. And even the border crossing, SCAG and the ports have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on models and tools in identifying the freight needs in a freight network, et cetera. So you have what you need for Southern California. It's all contained in our RTP. So, I urge you to basically make it a bottoms up for Southern California, and it'll actually expedite and lessen your load, certainly, for Southern California.
Okay. So you have a freight specific list in the RTP?
Oh yeah, it's been there for a number of years. I mean, we've done a lot in identifying our freight needs, developing the models, the tools, collaborating. With the touch of our fingertips, we can get the total trains in on the mainline freight lines, the total truck trips in the region, VMT, air quality, emissions, it's all there.
Thank
you. So we trust you can save a lot of time and money with your consultant team, and you know, I know that Fear and Peers has not done a lot of work in the region with freight, so we're ready to help you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Fred.
Kami, one thing, our SB1 is the biggest transportation bill in the history of our state and probably one of the biggest ever in the nation. And in that, we have a focus on fix it first, kind of getting ourselves to a state of good repair. I don't think we have any place where we really track the state of good repair from freight. And, you know, I've been out there saying fix freight first, but does it behoove us? I mean, I'm still thinking about how do we talk about all the various components we're doing. Should we, and I realize that we have mechanisms in place and dollars go different, into different tranches and stuff, but if we had any way of really encouraging our partners to think about fixing the freight corridors or thinking about freight when they fix, and you all have heard me talk about the study that UCI did that says if you raise the diesel taxes, the trucks are going to weigh more. Well, I want to make sure that when we repave or whatever we're doing, that those roads are going to hold because we want them to stay in a state of good repair. So just think about where's the proper place to try to put our arms around all of those dollars that are going into getting us a state of good repair. And that could go to our partners as well who.
Well, for us in the department, we have a very focused enterprise going on with asset management, and looking at a 10-year view of the asset. Now that focuses on one element of freight movement, which is the highway system and the bridges. And so each district actually just got done looking at the various asset classes that we have brought to the commission, and we'll be coming back to the commission with some programming on fix it first type items that really will fix freight corridors first. And so when you start to look at the asset management program that we have in place that we're sort of evolving and moving, quite frankly, well on, it has a very strong support for freight corridors, and so you will see that the prioritization of projects that are coming out of the department are those that are on those corridors. And I say that not just in terms of pavement, we're also actually doing, I think at the June meeting, we brought 22 bridges to the commission for adoption into the program. Those bridges were qualified specifically because of their impact on freight. And so we're looking at freight from that concerted perspective. We have these guys get together every month now we do this? The freight hot topics every. So we get together. It's always one of the fun times in my weeks is when we sit down and talk about freight, and it's become this conversation around freight that's multilateral, where we're looking at. I give you an example in the department. We have folks that are in the traffic operations program that permit excess load on the system. You couldn't tell them 2 years ago that they were doing freight, because that's what they did. But they did it well. We got loads through. We were able to work with our friends, the patrol, to get stuff through the state wherever it needed to be. Things always showed up. But they were not thinking that they were doing freight. Now, we brought them in to talk to our bridge folks, to talk to our planning folks, our freight planning folks, and there was some magic that happened because we started looking at projects differently. Projects that would have been prioritized before basically were not the ones that we're now seeing coming out of this conversation. And that's what led to the 22 bridges that you saw in June. And we'll bring some more accelerated bridge program projects too. So on the state highway system, we're looking at freight very concertedly, and we're also focusing SB1 dollars on those corridors that make for Fix It First that relates to freight. I think tomorrow I will be part of the conversation on PM2 and PM3, which are federal performance measures. The PM2 deals specifically with bridge and roadways on the NHS system. So trying to figure out how we implement asset management on the federal NHS, which has more than just state highways, but some access facilities to freight like ports or hubs will be on the local streets NHS. Those will also be part of the asset management discussions that we're going to have. So I think there's a lot of synergy that's happening, partly in terms of these conversations that we've been having here for the last couple of years, but also because we're beginning to see these conversations become part of state and federal regulations.
Well, I think maybe just how we talk about it maybe then, and it goes back to our earlier conversations of what else we are doing collectively. So I don't know if it belongs in the freight plan. Maybe there's some mention of that or something. But I think on the technology side, just we've had a lot of conversation to make sure that those ramps on the freeway where you're running 18-wheelers really work for an 18-wheeler to go through, the same we've had with our roundabout discussions and everything. One thing, though, also, the first and last mile is a whole topic into itself, I think, and somewhere we're hoping everybody's having that conversation and looking for solutions because it's a hot topic, and we're seeing more and more demand, especially with e-commerce. So I think somewhere if we address within our state freight plan or something the first and last mile efforts that are being done, I think that's a huge category. And then finally, to give you some kudos, Comey, in terms of freight training, I know you've worked hard with Tom O'Brien and others to really make sure that all of our folks have good training in this field, because it's not one that any of us came to naturally. I don't think, maybe there's one or two. Tina has a master's in maritime, I believe, but other than that, most of us studied something else. So I think to the extent we can encourage and broaden that base, we're all going to be more successful when everybody understands how the codependency works.
I was just going to mention, but Fran covered it, that the state rail or the state freight plan is the perfect place to have these conversations, especially as they relate to the state of repair for the freight systems.
Peter. Thank you very much. Yeah, we've had a great conversation today about the importance of the freight system to the state and actually the nation, as well as the need for projects, and apparently there's more coming even, and more being identified, and the need to prioritize those, as well as obviously the need for freight mobility and throughput in particular. And so I thought what struck me, it was actually slide 13 that was just put up. Going back to our conversation on selling California, it's, that the California context. Maybe instead of talking about the state, here California, the state wants this, it's more of really being a national issue. California is 10% of the national population. Just Southern California alone, as was pointed out, puts through 40% of the cargo that goes into the country. And of course, then there's other ports and other locations. So we really supply the nation, more so than any other location. And the context about on the East Coast, where you have a lot of states, and so they have more senators, it might be good to then take this California context map and flip it over onto the East Coast. Because then you have 14 states that, we could cut California up into and then have 28 senators, but we didn't do that. And I don't think anybody wants to try it right now, so I'm not suggesting that either. But just to make the point, and also the fact that with 10% of the population, I would bet maybe New York might mess it up a little bit, but most of those other states don't equate our population. They don't move the freight like we do. they are living to a great extent off. Now, they're trying to improve their ports there and bring more freight through there, which is a severe concern for California. But I think you can make the context, and maybe what we should be doing is not so much just focused on each individual grant, but setting up a really more California cell in general, so that then when the grant applications come through, California's already sold and overcome this situation that we've been talking about, as far as not getting, I think, our fair share, and I think Southern California in particular, with 40% of the cargo going through, definitely does not. But California as a whole, for now, we won't play north-south today. But California as a whole, really needs to have that kind of recognition as to what we do and what we've accomplished for the country. So talk about more as doing things for the country, not for the state, and maybe focus there more so. And I think, that might be one way to go. Also, as was been mentioned, some of the things is, particularly for freight, you have throughput, velocity, and reliability. And that's a key issue. And I think one thing that has to be done is the state needs to coordinate better, because currently I think they are sending many mixed messages that don't add up. And I think that can inhibit things that people are concerned whether or not California is going to be a reliable partner in the future, whether or not they're going to follow through. And in particular, I think one that needs, and I'm really asking for kind of an update, is the whole SB 743 and the VMT issue. There you have a state agency that went off quite actually far beyond what the statute called for and got into transportation. So if you have one agency saying we're going to decrease VMT, which means decrease throughput, decrease the ability for transportation projects to be built, how then are you going to get grants for money? So it seems like we're working at cross purposes, and it seems like this organization in particular, and all the fine work that's been done by everybody trying to improve mobility in the state, should be letting the state know, and in particular OPR and the Natural Resources Agency, that they're really contravening what we're trying to do that would actually lead to a win-win situation. So has there been any update on where that stands? It's been very quiet lately.
I haven't been tracking 743 lately, but I think the regs are being worked on. They're still not published yet. Yeah, so they're coming. I'm not sure in what shape, but I think your point is well taken. I think there are just two things, and I know we're running out of time. One, just the last point you were making about trying to not work at cross purposes. There are so many complex issues that we face in the state that demand solutions, and we can't walk away from any of them. We're trying to solve all of them. I think that the trick is to make sure that as we do that we don't work at cross purposes, and that's very difficult because stakeholders. We've tried in transportation to broaden our stakeholders so that we bring more folks to the table to have conversations about transportation, and ultimately also look at, for lack of a better phrasing, the pathologies of transportation to make sure that we have that in the calculus of what decisions we're making. We didn't used to do that, so it's been helpful to have public health and the communities very present where transportation decisions are being made. So that's been helpful. So I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing to have more people at the table. I think where we run afoul is when we're trying to solve a problem, and then we just are very narrow focused on the stakeholdership that's trying to solve that problem, because they're not looking to see what effects they may have. So your point's well taken in broadening that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I agree. I appreciate what you said and agree. And I mean, that's kind of the problem is, on this VMT issue, they've gone off in a silo and not taken into account. I mean, when you really boil it down to mobility and the ability to move goods is actually critical to everyone. Everybody wants to eat, sleep, and have clothing, and it's a necessity. And in the fact of the matter is, California is going to grow, projected to go to about 50 million. In Southern California, we have 17 million people here who are all looking. And on the great flyovers that were done, a lot of those rooftops don't send things across the country. It's to serve the people here. And if you don't allow the trucks and the trains and the vehicles to move by decreasing VMT, people are not going to get what they need. Everything you ate this morning, everything you're wearing, the chairs you're sitting in, and the house you live in have been on a truck. They've been in the goods movement system. And as population grows, more people are going to want more stuff. That's just not going to decrease. And so there's got to be that kind of reality. And I think it would be important for the goods movement system, and Comey, what you work on, to let the rest of the state agencies know that you cannot decrease VMT and expect people to have what is needed. Now, like you said, there's a lot of things to take into account, and we're doing that. Emissions are going down, and other things are improving. More to do, but you can't just pull the rug out. And I think that's going to be a very important thing in the future as we move forward in trying to achieve a proper balance. And unfortunately, right now, 743 does not do that. And again, transportation is not even in that bill.
Yeah, and 743 is not done yet, so I don't want to get into, I don't want to turn this into a VMT conversation, because I think we're trending in that direction. We've been able to find balance in the CTP 2040 in how we will grow as a state and yet limit the growth of VMT, because that's in the interest of our climate goals. I mean, we can all disagree on things, but there is a place for taking care of the climate impacts that we have at play. And so those are things that I think we can spend some more time talking about offline. But I want to get to your second point, which I think is also very important, which is the case about the context, being able to brand the state appropriately to sell across the country. I think that's an action item we need to take on. It goes to, I think, the point that Marnie excellently raised earlier on about a strategic presentation on how we kind of look at ourselves, or how we let others see ourselves. And I think you sort of touched on that again, so I'm taking that to be a hint, a very strong hint, that we need to spend some time on it. And it's not a typical discipline that we would engage in, but I think it's probably something important that we need to spend some time on, so I appreciate that. I know I promised to get you out at 2:30, and we are past 2:30. There's one more. Is that Tina? Okay, you're the reason we're delayed, Tina.
I know. Keeping the trains late. I'll take a chance to publicly bug Earl. I think finishing up the CUFCC or FC process is helpful, so we can get that behind us for the infra grants and everything. So I'm glad to hear that's coming. But I think, given the many things people have been talking about, and that you have Fair and Peers and a broad group there, it might be interesting to bring them to one of these meetings so they can hear the things that people would like to see expressed in the freight plan. And it comes to mind, and they're here. Good. I don't know where they are, but you're there. Okay. Fatima, okay. We have also struggled a lot with that economic contribution of freight to the state's economy, and I think with ERG, Paul Bingham should be able to help us get that nailed. I think that's been a hard spot, and so that's a great contribution for the team too, hopefully. Thanks.
Thanks, Tina. Actually, that then gets us into action items real quickly, and then we'll talk about next steps in terms of
so just a few things that I heard, and if we're not listening appropriately, please speak up. A few things you heard from Tasha. If you have any questions for Tasha specifically on anything you're considering on a technical level, do contact her, and the presentation that she spoke from will be available to the CFAC. We did put a call out for projects through our districts to have this conversation with the regional partners for infra. We will provide something for the CFAC as well to talk about our infra intents, and specifically the letter of support conversation, and how we can support your projects as you're thinking about those, and how we can partner on those. If you have any questions and concerns about the TCEP program, do contact Don Cheser about that. Keep in mind the next workshop is September 25th in Sacramento. Lots of good opportunities to have dialogue there as well. We will also be in attendance for that. We do want to hear more from you about project nominations, especially on the Caltrans side. I know that we teed up a few things, and maybe this is not the best way to have the conversation, but if you have specific ideas, specific thoughts, we want to hear from you on that. Raul discussed the need for this freight data group to get together. That was an idea at the last CFAC meeting. I think that's going to happen directly or indirectly as we develop the CFMP for 2019. So we will be bringing lots of data into that conversation, and I think there's a great opportunity to have a data discussion as part of that conversation. And then loud and clear, I heard selling California on freight nationally. I think we can do that as part of the CFMP development. As you heard, some of the team from the consultant side is in the room. I think we can craft some messaging, and maybe we can talk to you all about that, how best to do that.
Thank you, Chris. So we're about the end of the meeting. I think we were thinking at staff level about maybe scheduling a meeting for November. We figure it would be best to set a meeting before we get into the holidays. Otherwise, the next meeting is going to have to be in January. There are a number of things that need to be touched on between now and November. It seems like a short fuse, but it just seems like there's a need for another meeting. Proposal might be, and we're taking suggestions, is to have a meeting in the Valley, somewhere in Stockton, maybe. So I'm just throwing that out so that you kind of prepare yourselves for the next meeting. So there are a number of things that have come out of this conversation. I think definitely focus on the next round of funding that's going to the commission, the guidelines, the development of the CFMP, getting FAST Act compliant. There's just a number of weighty issues that we need to consider, and this group is hopefully poised to do that in November. Are there any last questions or comments from committee members?
Can I just make a quick
yeah,
statement?
Go ahead.
As you're wrapping things up, not really technical, but we did get a lot of stuff here, snacks, hoping that somebody would eat them. So before you guys go on the tour,
we didn't take a break. I'm sorry.
Well, they're in the back, so but they're available still.
We'll have a party here just after the meeting. Okay. So. All right. So, are there any members of the public that have comments or questions? See none. Thank you very much, and thank you to our great host, SBCTA, for hosting us. And I wish you all safe travels. We're adjourned.